Hi everyone, my name's Lorenza, and in this video I'm going to show you how I mark my patterns. I've had quite a few requests for this recently. Now, how I mark my patterns, I use really bright coloured thread. I love using these washable Crayola markers. I also love the Clover Chaco, I think that's how you say it, markers as well. So look, I'd say they're all the things I use for marking my patterns, and of course a very good pair of scissors. So I'm going to take you through 3 different examples because depending on what I'm making, I do mark patterns very differently. So I'll move this one out of the way for now. This will be my second example though, where I take you through a tissue, like a commercial paper pattern. But for now, the other sort of patterns I do is when they're on card like this. If I love a pattern a lot, I make it in this card pattern because it's just much quicker than having to pin and reuse these tissue patterns, because I feel like they just start to fall apart, or your darts or your markings, they get pretty frail. So if I love a pattern, I trace it out in card. So if I was just tracing out this pattern, I've got these huge heavy pattern marker weights. For something this small, I'd probably just hold it with my hand and trace around it, or put the pattern marker a bit on there. Now, making sure I've lined it up with the straight grain, there's my straight grain there. I would just, with these, I always just draw around with one of these washable markers, or I use one of these pens, depending on what the fabric is. I'm loving these Crayola washable markers lately. So I would literally just go along, and you see I'm marking in the notches there with the marker. So I just go around, trace the pattern when it's a card pattern like this, and that's how I'm marking my notches. But I wouldn't leave it there with just the marker. Now often this would be, because this is 2 fabric and 2 lining, so this would be 2 layers of fabric. I have just done 1 layer of here, but I would then cut out the 2 layers, and as I'm cutting it, so I'll just cut this bit just to show you. As I'm cutting this bit, when I get to that notch there, with my scissors, now you've got to make sure they're sharp, because otherwise a blunt pair of scissors won't do this, but I would just cut in that notch there. So just make that little nick into the fabric, about 5 mil. Most of my patterns I work with are a 1 centimeter or a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance, so I'm happy to cut in that 5 mil nick. Now I know some people say we shouldn't do that because you can't take back out the pattern again if it's too small, but I always make a mock-up first in calico, so when I'm cutting with my fashion fabric, I know it fits, so I'm happy to make a little cut into the fabric like that. So same as if I'll just finish off this pattern if I was cutting it out. I know it would be 2 layers here, and I'd be cutting those 2 layers at the same time and doing the notches at the same time as well. So I'd cut through those 2 layers and make that little nick. So if I was working with calico cotton, this is a polyester taffeta, I would be doing it like this. I will say with this fabric though as well, I think I was a little bit worried about my notches coming out, so I did use thread. So what I would do in that instance, so I might even cut it and mark it with the texter. Yes, I'm a bit overboard, but then I just always use really bright colored thread. So I love red, pink and blue, and if I was just going through and wanting to make sure that was, I'll zoom in here so you can just see what I'm doing. Whoa, not that much. So I would just make that marking as well with a little bit of thread there. So just, and then I pushed it straight through, didn't I? So maybe like 2 mil, and then I just trim it. Let me get some clippers, just so it's really obvious to my eye when it's there. So you can see it's visible from that side, it's going to be visible from that side as well. So if I was being really particular, and when I did make this top, I was being particular. So I think I marked it with cutting in the notches, and then I marked it with the thread as well, because I just didn't want to lose any of my notches. So that is how I would mark if I was doing cotton, polyester taffeta, things I'm not too worried about fraying. That is how I would mark it. I'd trace around it and cut in with the scissors to cut in those notches. Now if I can, let's do a hypothetical. If this had a dart, let's just draw in a dart. We'll make it there. And you can see how these markers, they are still working on the flower, but if it was hard to see, I would just mark with a thread. But let's just draw in a dart. And I do always draw in the lines on my darts, because when I'm sewing, I feel like you can get it pretty off if you're not drawing in the lines of the darts. So again, I would do it with a marker. Yeah, I'd always try and draw that in with a marker. So But let's imagine this was 2 layers. So if I was cutting this out, so I'd be cutting in those little nicks there to know that that's a dart. And let's just pretend, this might not work, but I'll give it a go. If there was 2 layers there, so imagining we're needing to mark that dot there, and we would be we'll put wrong sides together for the sake of this. The way I mark darts on fabric like this, and I'll do it on the other fabric as well, but just to show you, I push a pin through, and I didn't learn this anywhere, this is just how I do it, but I push a pin through my darts, I open it on that side, because remember when you're sewing your darts, you're not sewing them from the right side, you're sewing them from the wrong side. And then I just mark like that, really messily, basically. But when you then go to sew your dart, you've got the dart points there of where you need to do that dart. But sorry, I did say I would mark my dart line. So in that instance, where I've done those cuts, I'd then just line this up. You can see them there, I've cut them, and I just draw them in again. I always draw them on the wrong side of my fabric. I think it's important to do. And I know this is a pretend dart and it's a terrible dart, but I'm just showing you for the sake of it. So then when we took it to the sewing machine to sew it, we would join up those notches there, push the pin through to make sure that dart, look, that looks terrible. So probably because I just drew the dart, which was not a great idea. That's looking better. So you see, you want to be able to see those 2 sides of the dart. So I always mark my darts. I mark the end point, the bust point of them, and I definitely mark the notches, and I really like to draw them in. So this is all on fabric where, look, it's really easy to see everything. It's white on this side. The markers are working beautifully. Look, this is all pretty easy. Cottons, taffetas, you know. So let's move on to the harder fabric. Things like linings and beautiful chiffons. So say this fabric, this beautiful fabric, it was very hard to see markings on it because of the print. It's beautiful, but also I find this sort of slippery fabric like this chiffon, even when you put threads in it, the threads can often just want to completely slide out. They love this fabric. And I think I found with the markers on this, the markers bled a fair bit. So you'd make a mark and then be like, where was it again? So, and as well, I didn't cut any of my notches in on this sort of fabric because the fray factor of chiffon is out of control. So I get quite scared of that. So I would never, the way I showed you here, doing those notches where I cut them in on the other fabric, I would never do that on something like a chiffon or a georgette because I would just be very worried about it fraying. So fabric like this, the fabric that just absolutely wants to fray, back to marking with thread. Yes, you can still mark with marker, but I'd be marking like with everything. I'd be doing thread markers. Do not cut your notches in with scissors though on this fabric. So I've got a great example here, and I've done this on some lining fabric to sort of give the idea of the same as if we were doing it with the chiffon. And ignore all my drawings over this because I used it for a reel, but you'll still get the idea. So how I would be doing the markings on this. So I've pinned all of my pattern out, and look, we've got some darts to do, and we've got some notches and some, what are they called? Like matching those dots, points. Oh my gosh, I'm having a brain freeze. So how I would mark these. So I would, like I showed with the other one, I like to poke the pin through for the darts. And like I said, I was not taught this. This is just like my hack for the way I do it. So down here, let's do all the darts at once. So I would just mark them like this with the texture. And if it was really slippery fabric, I would go along as well and mark with thread these. In this kind of fabric, I wouldn't, this is lining. I think the texture, that's obvious enough, so that would absolutely stay. On this kind of fabric, I'd probably do texture and the thread. And so then what I do is I take some of the pins out because you've got that pin in there, so that's holding that dart in place, or both of them. And again, on the inside, I do that sort of where I just mark it. Like that. So I've done that dart, so you see I've marked it there. If it was a floral fabric or fabric that's really hard to see, I would also, I'm trying to pick up some thread over here. I would also mark it, and I would just, I'll zoom in so you can see, I'm just doing just nicking the fabric there, so getting, I don't know, a few strands. It doesn't have to be a huge amount. You can see there that will mark that that's where that dart is. And again, remember to mark this on the inside, because if you mark it on the outside of your fabric, you're still going to have to transfer it over. So there's those ones. And again, this is 2 layers of fabric here. Now see how that marker didn't go through onto that side? So I think in this instance, if I mean, I'm just going to do it how I would be doing it myself. So let's cut this out. And so I'll draw that one again. That didn't really go through. I'd probably just turn it over, and so you can see it's kind of coming through there. I'd go like that. And if I was really worried, again, I'd mark it with the thread. You've just got to make sure this is going through. See how now that's on 4 sides, and that dart, whoops, we'll take that pin out again. That dart's marked with thread and the marker on the inside. I know this is maybe a bit over the top, but this is just how I like to mark my darts. So as we're getting other notches over here, if I was cutting this out, like I said, on this sort of fabric, I'm hesitant to cut in my notches. So here, sorry, the aircon's on, so it's blowing a little bit. It's warm in Melbourne today, which was lovely. It was 33 degrees in Australia. So I'd mark that notch there and just making sure it's coming through. Again, if I was worried, I'd do it with the thread again, a nice bright colored thread. And I will just do it to show you. Marking is so tedious. This is why I tend to cut my pattern out one night, and then the next night or the next time I get to it, I will then do all the markings, because you've got to do the markings. So I would just grab a bit of thread like this. I'm just pulling it through once, and often I do a double thread. I find if you just do a single thread like I've done there, just that single thread, they'll often want to fall out. So I do try and do a double thread. So I'll do this one again. So in order to do that, you want, there's my needle. I want this to be double thread at the end. So if I was doing the other side here, I'd just grab a little bit of fabric there. And I leave, I don't know, a couple of centimeters either side. Honestly, that's not going to fall out. When there's 2 there, it won't. When there's 1, yes, they'll slide out. So you can see that's how I'm just grabbing. Oh, there's that top. See that top one slid out already? This is why 1 thread of fabric, there it is, it has fallen out. So this is why I do 2. I do find that they stick in if you do 2 like that. So that is how I would do it on more slippery fabric. With these sort of marks, again, I'd do texture and the thread, and I'd do it the same way that I was doing those dart points. So I push a pin through the middle, and then you're able to mark it on both sides there. See where the needle is there. Because if you're pushing that pin through exactly at that perfect point, when you lift it up, where that pin is going through, that is that exact point. So I do just find this the easiest way to get your markings through. I know you could use, like, be trying to push through the marking from the front here, but I just find it much easier to push that pin through, because you know it is so centered and so perfect that when you lift the fabric, you know that those markings are going to be perfect. And then you can just take it out and it's done. Well, that looks like it's bled through a bit. So that is how I would do thinner fabric. Now there was just one other thing I wanted to show you, because I had this pattern where it had this is not the fabric for the pattern, but it had a fold line in it. And what I do in that instance, see, I've already put the pins in here because I was prepping myself, but I've drawn in this fold line. Hypothetically, let's imagine this is a fold line on your dress or your garment, and it needs to be folded perfectly that way and pressed and sewn, etc. So you need to mark in these huge gigantic lines. Now this does happen on jackets and dresses and things that have a fold at the front, or like a lapel, and yes, you're going to have to baste that in. But again, I use that pin technique. So because when you're working with the pattern, you've just got the pattern on the top, and you don't want to just be making the markings to just this one layer. You need to make it to both layers. So again, I would put the pins in, and then that is how I would mark it on the other side. See, without having to lift the pattern piece and then place it onto the other side. So where these pins have come through, you can just mark those exact points with the pins. You take them out. Let's imagine that your fabric would be pinned together though. I'm doing this quite haphazardly, but I think you'll get the idea. So remember we drew those lines in from those pins that were placed through because they were perfectly there. So then you know that's your other fold line. Now you could just get the pattern piece and do it on the other side, but I find this a quicker, easier way. And I know you're not meant to move patterns around a hell of a lot, pattern pieces, when you're cutting them out because things shift, but that is what I do. So I'd probably cut out the pattern piece, then put the lines. So imagine the paper, imagine that paper's there. I'd probably pop all the pins through. Like imagine that has the fold line drawn on that pattern piece, flip it over and then draw all the lines in. So your pattern piece is already cut and then I'd be marking in this fold line. So you've got your two fold lines there and there. And then annoyingly, because you have to do it to both sides, don't you? You would fold the pattern out, but at least now you've got those fold lines. See how they're symmetrical on either side. And now I would baste in that fold line. You can just leave it drawn in. I was working with a dress though that had this sort of complicated, it wasn't knit, it was a complicated color, and none of the, I tried using this chalk, nothing, it was just fading off and coming off really quickly. So I would very messily, and I've chosen a color that's not great to see on here, but I would just baste it. And you don't have to do this pretty. You're just trying to follow that line because that line will probably fade from your marker. Or if you're working with a fabric that you're way too scared to use any kind of markers or texture on, that definitely happens as well. Although I feel like these washable markers are pretty amazing and they wash out of everything. So I would just really messily kind of baste it in like that. So then it's a great guide. And then yes, you're gonna have to go over to this side and baste it as well to show that that's that fold line for when you're sewing it. So yeah, they are sort of the three ways if you're having to do a big fold line basting stitch. You could also do the basting for the darts if you wanted. Look, it really comes down to your personal preference. I don't think there's any right, wrong, particular way to do this. You do what works for you when you're marking your patterns. And look, some of my ways are probably a little bit odd, but I really love that method of pushing the pin through, especially when you've got two sides. I think when I first started sewing, I found it very hard. How do I get, I've made these beautiful markings on one side. How on earth do I get them now onto the other side? So I did find pushing pins through. That's sort of my trick. That's my knack for all of my patterns when I'm trying to do markings. So that was if we had to do a fold line, a basting stitch. I showed you back here with the darts and how I pushed the pins through and did some of those little tacking stitches, and then back to the very first one I did where I cut them in with the scissors. So they are the three different ways that three different examples of how I mark my patterns. I think there was a smattering of ways that I mark my patterns in there. I hope I explained them all well and that helps you when you're marking patterns. And yeah, if you come up with little tips and tricks that make it a bit easy for you to mark your patterns, just do it. Like I said, I don't think there's any particularly right and wrong way. I'm sure there are textbook ways, but that is how I mark my patterns. So get yourself some bright colored thread, get yourself these washable markers, and I didn't use it in this video, but yeah, I love these chalk. I find this better on sort of woven, heavier or stretch woven fabrics, those Chaco clover markers. I do have all of this stuff as well on my Amazon store. So I hope you enjoyed that, and good luck with marking all of your patterns. Thanks, bye.